Please wait for the moderator to start the conference, then press star 1. A system tone will be heard when you're
Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Today we're talking about Statistics Canada is presenting the 2021 census data on First Nations people, Metis and Inuit in Canada and Canada's housing. Joining us virtually is Christopher Penny, Director for the Centre of Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships, Eric Olson, Assistant Director, Centre for Income and Socioeconomic Wellbeing Statistics, et André Bernard, directeur adjoint du Centre de l'information sur le marché du travail. Mon nom est Catherine Lévesque, je suis journaliste pour le National Post et c'est moi qui va modérer la conférence de presse. Donc, on va laisser nos panélistes prendre la parole et ensuite on passera à la...
We are going to be having some presentations and then a question period. Go ahead.
The floor is yours if you want to start talking.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Chris Penny. I am the Director of the Centre for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships at Statistics Canada. I'm grateful to be joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation, who are the first people to walk the lands on which the nation's capital is located today. I'm speaking with you today to present the fifth set of results from the 2021 census. This material is available through our official release bulletin, The Daily, as well as through our new tools such as the StatsCan Act, social media channels, and more. We encourage all Canadians to browse these new platforms and learn more about the rich stories these data show us. Je remercie sincèrement tous les Canadiens.
I would like to thank all Canadians for their participation and for their answers. Today's release is about Indigenous peoples in Canada as well as housing in Canada.
People Métis and Inuit in Canada from today's release, and invite my colleague Eric Olson, Assistant Director with the Centre for Income and Socioeconomic Wellbeing Statistics, to provide an overview of Canada's housing. I will be speaking in English for the duration of this presentation. However, my colleague André Bernard will be present should you have any questions in French. A number of census products are released today by Statistics Canada, and they are available free on our website. Key findings and stories can be found in analytical documents. We have released 2 daily articles on the key findings related to Indigenous peoples and housing in Canada. Included in these 2 documents are interesting charts, maps, and international comparisons. There are also 2 census in brief articles, one on membership in a Métis organization or settlement, the other one on housing conditions among First Nations people, Métis and Inuit in Canada. There are also 2 infographics, one on Indigenous peoples, the other one on housing. On the StatCan website, you will also find many data products, including the census data tables and several visualization tools allowing you to easily and quickly get the census counts for any community in this country. Also available are a number of reference products if you need information on definitions and concepts. Let's begin with key findings on First Nations people, Métis, and Inuit in Canada. These data provide the portrait of Indigenous people and communities and could not have been possible without the participation of First Nations people, Métis, and Inuit across Canada. Over 1.8 million Indigenous people were counted in the 2021 census. Indigenous people now account for 5% of the total population of Canada, up from 4.9 in 2016. The census questionnaire asked respondents if they were First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, the 3 Indigenous groups recognized in the Constitution Act. Those who reported being First Nations accounted for over half of the Indigenous population, while just over 1/3 were Métis and 3.9% were Inuit. The remaining share of the population was those who reported multiple Indigenous identities, for example, Métis and First Nations, and those who were part of the Indigenous population not included elsewhere. Ontario had the largest Indigenous population of all provinces and territories in 2021 at 406,590 people. British Columbia had the next largest Indigenous population, followed by Alberta and Manitoba. Indigenous people made up a large share of the total population in the territories, accounting for over 4/5 of the population of Nunavut, almost half in the Northwest Territories, and over 1/5 in Yukon. Provincially, Manitoba's population had the highest share of Indigenous people, followed by Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Alberta. The Indigenous population grew by 9.4% from 2016 to 2021, surpassing the growth of the non-Indigenous population over the same time period. However, this growth was not as rapid as in years past. For example, from 2011 to 2016, the Indigenous population grew by 18.9%, over double the 2021 growth rate. The First Nations population totaled over 1 million and grew by 9.7% overall from 2016 to 2021. However, the pace of growth was much slower for First Nations people with registered or treaty Indian status compared with those without registered or treaty Indian status. In 2021, there were 624,220 Métis living in Canada, up 6.3% from 2016. Census counted 70,545 Inuit living in Canada in 2021, and the Inuit population grew by 8.5%. Looking now at age, the Indigenous population is younger than the non-Indigenous population, which continues a trend observed in previous censuses. The average age of Indigenous people was 33.6 years in 2021, compared with 41.8 years for the non-Indigenous population. Inuit were the youngest of the three groups, with an average age of 28.9 years, followed by First Nations people and Métis. Despite the relative youth of Indigenous people, the share of Indigenous people aged 65 years and older continues to grow. From 2016 to 2021, the share of Indigenous people aged 65 years and older rose from 7.3% to 9.5%. At the same time, young children aged 0 to 4 years make up a smaller share of the Indigenous population than in the past. Looking now at First Nations people, for the first time, the census population enumerated more than 1 million First Nations people living in Canada. While more than half of all First Nations people lived in Western Canada, Ontario had the largest number of First Nations people provincially, making up 1/4 of the First Nations population in Canada. 1 in 9 First Nations people lived in Quebec, and 7.6% lived in Atlantic Canada. The remaining 1.9% lived in the territories. Almost 3/4 of First Nations people had registered or treaty Indian status under the Indian Act, while 28.2% did not. The share of First Nations people with registered or treaty Indian status was higher in 2016, reflecting the fact that the First Nations population who did not have registered or treaty Indian status grew at a much faster pace in 2021 than the population with registered or treaty Indian status. For Métis, the census counted 624,220 Métis living in Canada in 2021, up 6.3% from 2016. While the growth of the Métis population outpaced that of the non-Indigenous population over the same period, the difference was not as great as in years past. For example, from 2011 to 2016, the population identifying as Métis grew by almost 1/3. Following engagement with Métis organizations, governments, and stakeholders, the 2021 Census of Population long-form questionnaire collected data on membership in a Métis organization or settlement for the first time. The census counted 224,655 people reporting registered membership in a Métis organization or settlement, with 4/5 reporting being a member of one of the 5 signatories of the Canada Métis Nation Accord. These new data will help Métis governments and organizations better understand the demographic, social, and economic characteristics of their citizens. For Inuit, the census counted 70,545 Inuit living in Canada in 2021, up 8.5% from 5 years earlier. Over 2/3 of Inuit lived in Inuit Nunangat, the homeland of Inuit in Canada. The Inuit population living outside Inuit Nunangat grew at a faster pace than the population within the Inuit homeland. A new question asked respondents who identify themselves or another member of their household as an Indigenous person, asking, is this person enrolled under or a beneficiary of an Inuit land claims agreement? 4/5 of Inuit in Canada reported that they were enrolled under or were a beneficiary of an Inuit land claims agreement. The largest group of claimants was part of the Nunavut land claims agreement, and most of this group lived within the territory of Nunavut. The next largest group was members of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, with 79.5% of this group living in Nunavik. Looking now at the urban population, In 2021, more than 800,000 Indigenous people lived in a large urban center. Indigenous people were more likely to live in a large city in 2021 than in 2016. Over this 5-year period, the Indigenous population living in a large urban center grew by 12.5%, and the share of Indigenous people living in a large urban center rose from 43% to 44%. Winnipeg had the largest Indigenous population at 102,080 people in 2021, followed by Edmonton and Vancouver. Because of a number of barriers faced by Indigenous communities, inadequate housing conditions are a significant issue among Indigenous people in Canada. Almost 1 in 6 Indigenous people lived in a dwelling that was in need of major repairs in 2021, a rate almost 3 times higher than for the non-Indigenous population. Despite overall higher shares of Indigenous people living in a dwelling that required major repair, the share of Indigenous people living in such a dwelling fell 2.7 percentage points from 2016 to 2021. The gap between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations also decreased from 13 percentage points in 2016 to 10.7 percentage points in 2021. In 2021, 17.1% of Indigenous people lived in crowded housing considered not suitable for the number of people who live there, according to the National Occupancy Standard. By comparison, 9.4% of the non-Indigenous population lived in crowded housing. While Indigenous people were more likely to live in crowded housing compared with the non-Indigenous population, the gap between the two groups narrowed from 9.5 percentage points in 2016 to 7.8 percentage points in 2021. Finally, looking at language, 237,420 Indigenous people in Canada could speak an Indigenous language well enough to conduct a conversation. From 2016 to 2021, the number of Indigenous people who reported that they could speak an Indigenous language well enough to conduct a conversation declined by 4.3%. While the number of people with an Indigenous mother tongue has been in decline, there is growth in the number of Indigenous second language speakers. The number of Indigenous people who could speak an Indigenous language and had an Indigenous mother tongue fell by 8.1%. However, the number of Indigenous people who could speak an Indigenous language but did not have an Indigenous mother tongue grew by 7% over the same period. This change reflects a growing share of Indigenous people who are learning an Indigenous language as a second language. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss data on First Nations people, Inuit and Métis. I would now like to invite my colleague Eric Olson to present on housing statistics.
Bonjour.
Hello, my name is Eric Olson. I am Assistant Director for Statistics Canada for Wellbeing and Income. We are now going to look at the census results for 2021 for housing.
2021 Census of Population on the housing of Canadians. The release highlights the changes in home ownership over the past decade, how differences across generations and recent construction patterns have contributed to changes in the home ownership rate. And today's release also presents the rising importance of condominiums, especially in the fast-growing downtown areas, and how the impact of increases in government transfers, including temporary pandemic-related benefits and low interest rates, led to improvements in housing affordability in 2021. On our website, the census also showcases regional and local data for communities ranging from large urban centers to smaller census subdivisions, showing the incredible diversity of housing experiences throughout the country. The census shows that in 2021, 10 million households in Canada owned the home they were living in. This is more than at any point in our history and 8.4% more than a decade earlier. However, while the total number of owners continued to grow over those 10 years, the number of renters was also growing, but at a clip twice as fast, 21.5% from 2011 to 2021, up to 5 million renter households. And therefore, Canadians overall were less likely to own their home in 2021, 66.5%, than they were in 2011, which featured a record high of homeowners. This decline in the rate follows a period of relatively rapid growth of the home ownership rate, an increase of 5 percentage points over the 1996 to 2006 decade. In those 10 years, the number of renting households actually declined by 0.7%, while owner households increased with a growth of 23.7%. Regionally, the homeownership rate dropped in 12 of the 13 provinces and territories. The exception was the Northwest Territories. The largest declines occurred in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, with the declines of 4.6 and 4 percentage points, respectively, while British Columbia and Ontario recorded the next largest declines, just over 3 percentage points each. The Northwest Territories was the only province or territory to record an increase in the home ownership rate over those 10 years by 2 percentage points. These changes in home ownership seen across most of the country have happened while the share of people living alone or with roommates have been rising. This was reported in the July Census Families and Households release. And people who live alone or with roommates are less likely to own their home than other household types, such as couples with or without children. Bien sûr, on a aussi
We've also seen variations in home ownership depending on age groups and where people are in their stages of life. From 2011 to 2021, household ownership went down for adults under 75. Home ownership went down, especially for people from 25 to 29 years old, from 44% in 2011 to 36% in 2021. From 30 to 34 years old, there was also a decrease from 7 percentage points. For older people, we see less of a decrease of home ownership. From 70 to 74 years old, home ownership went down by less than 1 percentage point to be just below 3/4 of a decrease. 3/4 of home ownership. Over 85 years old, home ownership was slightly lower than 10 years ago. Many Canadians are homeowners in this group. We can see that we have an aging population, and now there are more services at home, and we can see this increase over coming decades. The decrease in homeownership reflects recent changes in construction and more dense urban centers. There's also housing shortages, meaning that we are building more rental homes. The market has been responding to needs, and there are more homes again for renting. In 2011, apartments were less than 40% of homes we were building. Since 2011, there have been more building permits, 60% of them for rental homes. These trends respond to housing needs because of an increase in our population, also an aging population, and we see more and more people, especially young people, wanting to live in downtown areas. Because of this recent increase in apartments, buildings built since 2016 are more likely to be occupied by renters. More than 2 out of 5 homes built between 2016 to 2021 were for renters. This is more than we've ever seen. This is except for dwellings built in the 60s and apartments after the wartime period. More than 2/3 of dwellings built from up until 2021 were rented by millennials between 25 and 40 years old in 2021. This is the greatest proportion of all generations. This is also the largest group owning condos. 30% of condos are owned by or occupied by millennials.
Densification plans to bring more people into the urban core. As these plans unfold, the dwelling stock has grown skyward, with high-rise apartments and condominiums spurring the strong population growth in these regions. In 2021, 9 out of 10 condominiums were located in the Census metropolitan area. And while condominiums accounted for 1 in 6 dwellings nationally, 2 in 5 dwellings in Canada's primary downtowns were condos. Interestingly, just over half of all condos located in the downtowns of CMAs across Canada were rented out in 2021. Over half of the dwellings in the downtowns of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver were condos, and more of half of these condos were rented. The census considers housing affordability not as the price to buy a house, as we sometimes hear, but I'll come back to that, but rather by comparing the monthly shelter costs paid in relation to income. The shelter costs include utility payments for electricity, heat, and water, and for renters it includes rent, while for owners, mortgage payments and property taxes. The 2021 census showed that, not adjusted for inflation, the median monthly shelter cost paid by renters grew by 18% from 2016 to 2021. This growth outpaced the All Items Consumer Price Index over the same period, which was 9.5% over those 5 years. The median monthly shelter cost payments for owners grew by 9.7% over the same period, again, not adjusted for inflation, and this was much closer to the All Items inflation rate. Back in July, Statistics Canada presented more information from the 2021 census on how the temporary pandemic benefits cushioned the losses for low-income earners in 2020. So as shelter costs rose, at the same time, the median household income of renters, not adjusted for inflation, grew by 31% from 2015 to 2020. And owners saw their median household income grow by 14.6% over the same period. And thus, when household incomes grow faster than shelter costs, as they did up to the 2021 census, this creates conditions for improved housing affordability. So the rate of unaffordable housing, or the proportion of households that spent more than 30% of their income on shelter costs, fell from 24.1% in 2016 to 20.9% in 2021. The rate of unaffordable housing in Canada for renters fell from 40% in 2016 to just over 33% in 2021, with most of the decline occurring among renters earning below the median household income of all renters. Unaffordable housing rates are highest in downtowns. In 33 of the 42 downtowns in our large urban centers, the percentage of renters spending more than 30% of their income on shelter costs was above the national average. And approximately half of the renters in downtowns of Kingston, Barrie, Halifax, 24.2%, had the highest rates of unaffordable housing among the provinces and territories in 2021. In Atlantic Canada, where home ownership rates tend to be higher, the rates of unaffordable housing were lower.
Statistics Canada has worked with the Canadian Society of Mortgages and Housing to give indicators on core housing need. We can see that there is a lot of core housing need for housing when homes are considered to not be large enough or are of too low quality, or when a homeowner cannot afford to buy another home in their area. In 2021, 1.5 Canadian homeowners had core housing needs. The core housing need rate decreased from 12.7 in 2016 to 10.1% in 2021. There is a less greater number of owners who have core housing needs compared to renters. This is because generally they have a higher income and can pay the typical price to rent a home in their local market. In Canada, core housing needs for owners were at 5.4%, much less than that of renters at 20%. Renters are more likely to have core housing needs than owners, and this is in all areas. In Montreal, about 14% of renters were likely to have core housing needs, much more than owners. In Toronto and in Vancouver, renters were more than 2 times more likely to have core housing needs than homeowners. In 2021, our census allowed us to take a look at what prices homeowners were expecting to sell their home at. This has also been we've also looked at property tax and the homes that were sold during a certain period and what they were sold at. So without taking into account inflation, there was an increase of 39% of expectations for prices at which homeowners would be selling their homes.
Cette croissance des valeurs attendues dans les municipalités de 2000 ménages ou plus.
The interpretation will resume when the image quality has improved. Thank you.
La moitié en Colombie-Britannique ont vu la valeur moyenne de leur logement augmenter de plus de 50%. Dans les territoires et au Canada atlantique, l'augmentation était à un rythme plus lent qu'en Ontario, en Colombie-Britannique et au Québec, un peu plus de 20% en 5 ans. Les propriétaires des logements dans les prairies ont enregistré la plus faible croissance de la moyenne parmi toutes les régions, avec 2,2%, de sorte que les prix attendus en 2021 y étaient généralement comparables à ceux déclarés 5 ans plus tôt. En terminant, je vous rappelle qu'il s'agit aujourd'hui de la 5e diffusion des résultats du recensement de 2021. On invite la population à consulter les données de leur recensement sur le site web de Statistique Canada et de rester à l'affût des prochaines diffusions à venir au cours des prochains mois. La prochaine diffusion aura lieu en octobre et portera sur la citoyenneté et l'immigration au Canada, la composition ethnoculturelle et religieuse de la population, ainsi que la mobilité et la migration. Je vous remercie de votre attention et nous ferons
À la période des questions, alors on a...
Thank you. We are going to go to the question period. We have some people on Zoom, so if you would like to use the raise hand function.
On Zoom, if you do have a question, please use the raised hand function so I can unmute you. Okay, we will start with Fraser Needham, APTN. You can go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. I guess obviously one of the main things came out is the Indigenous population continues to grow, of course, and outpace the non-Indigenous population, but it's significantly slowed since the last census. Any ideas as to why that is?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, in general, what we've seen in the census over many years is that population growth and population counts are affected by a number of factors, one of which being what we call natural population growth, that is births and then differences in life expectancy and increasing lifespans. But we also see other growth from response mobility, and this is people that are answering the census differently in one year than they do in the past. And this can be due to a number of factors. There have been a number of court decisions or legislative changes that have changed the requirements or the eligibility for the Indian Act or for other agreements. There are the signatures of modern treaties or other modern agreements, and there are court decisions as well as broader societal factors that can influence how people choose to report. So these two factors are at play here. One thing that we do note, and these data are further in detail on our website right now, is that we see differences when it comes to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, and we see differences at the regional level as well. So we see Métis growth has slowed, and we see First Nations with registry status has slowed. Again, all still higher than the non-Indigenous population. But these are some of the things that we've observed, and then as we look further and as others look at these data, we'll be able to see different patterns in that way.
Okay, yeah, so I guess you're still analyzing it. Well, it does go against like the trends that have been that you're able to see some of the reasons why, but it seems to be going against an overall trend, I suppose, for census in recent times.
Not going against the trend. Again, the population is growing, and it's growing at a faster rate. It's just that this faster rate of growth is slower than in the past. So we are still seeing the same general trend, but the trajectory is a little different.
Right. Okay. And the other question thing I noted is that very large growth in Inuit population outside of Nunavut, or the north anyway, and it's quite substantial. I have heard actually that here in Ottawa there's a large Inuit community that they have often feel that they're actually still undercounted in terms of census data, and that is there. Have you found any challenges to tracking Inuit population outside of the northern regions?
Thanks for that. There's a couple of points I'd like to mention. First off, yes, the number of Inuit living outside of Inuit Nunangat has increased higher than the proportion in Inuit Nunangat, although that has also increased. One thing we do not have data for at this time is data on individuals that have moved from one census to another. So data on migration will be coming out in October. So when we have this information, we'll be able to add that and provide a more complete picture what's going on there. I can say, and related to your first question, the amount of response mobility or changes in questionnaire response over time we see for Inuit is very low. So that traditionally has not been a factor. As far as the population that is in Ottawa at any given time, that's a slightly different concept. So in the census, we focus on the concept known as the usual place of residence. So, for example, we know that many Inuit come to Ottawa to receive medical treatment or to support family members who do, for services or for work on a temporary basis. And so when Statistics Canada enumerates individuals like this, we ensure that and there are specific questions on the questionnaire for this, to ensure that people are counted in their usual place of residence. So we ask if this is the normal place they live, is there another residence? And then, so people that are here temporarily would be counted in their home community and home region. So that's one factor. And then we also do a lot of outreach and other activities to ensure that we are continuing to maintain the high coverage that we do. And we do have very good response, and we're very pleased with the response that we've gotten from Indigenous communities, both in the north and in the south, thanks to the goodwill of First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and the work of the census crews.
Okay, we're going to go to Nujo Dalmales from the...
Question is about how much do you believe the housing landscape has changed since the collection of this data? We see this year specifically housing prices falling considerably, interest rates rising. Like, what caveats are there for people to consider when they're looking at this data, given the changes that have happened since then?
Right, that's an excellent question. What we've reported today was the 21 situation, and some of it was using the 2020 income. And so the situation has changed somewhat since then. I mean, just yesterday we had a release of the Consumer Price Index that showed the growth in prices in more recent terms. And as you alluded to, there are some indications that the housing market might be softening, and so house prices might be coming down. So that but they had also grown since the census, which was conducted in May and throughout 2021, at least until early this year in most cases. Obviously, the interest rates will have a direct bearing on the shelter costs for anyone who is undertaking a new mortgage or renewing a mortgage, and for those that are at variable mortgage rates, in some cases, they would be paying more for their mortgage, and so that would increase the shelter costs for homeowners. And depending on how the markets react, we will see as well possibly some increases in rental prices, and so there have been a number of changes in the markets that make that you have to interpret to get the data right here.
Thank you. And my second question is about this trend of, for those who are living with roommates, which is a larger number of people, for them, they're more likely to find their shelter costs to be affordable. Same with couples. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, to interpret these two trends, because I guess, we could see the affordability rate rising, but then if more people are living with roommates or are in couples, that might be a coping mechanism to deal with affordability. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what we show in the census really is once the housing decisions are made, so these are people who are living together. We don't know exactly why they're living together. And it may be coping decisions, and that we have to. I guess more study is required. But what we do see is, for example, the rate of unaffordable housing and the rate of core housing need are much lower for households where there's more than one person, either roommates versus people living alone, or couples versus people living alone. So in a similar way, there are people who are in rental housing that may prefer or may have liked to be in owned housing or to own their house, or vice versa. Some people are looking for more flexibility, but they're in their house and they haven't had the occasion to sell it or to change. So that's I guess some other factors where we're seeing exactly the product of all those decisions that people have made vis-a-vis the prices that they're facing, the resources they have, and the lifestyle that they want or that they choose within the available set.
Next up is Julia Wong from CBC.
Hi there. In relation to the Indigenous population growing from 2016, understanding that it is slightly slower than the pace that we've seen in the past, the report speaks to how this may be the result of higher birth rates, but also that more people are likely to identify as Indigenous. I'm just wondering how much of that increase can be specifically pegged to people being more likely to identify as Indigenous.
Thank you for that question. The answer is that it absolutely can be studied, and this is one of the things that is available to be seen in the data. Right now we have the first release of these data, and so this is the sort of question that can be looked at. We have produced reports on fertility, reports on life expectancy, and other things such as response mobility, as mentioned in the past. So these are all things that we can consider going forward, and that other researchers and data users can consider. So that information on people's responses can be examined. Yes.
Okay, so my understanding is we may get a better sense of that perhaps in the future, or it is continuing to be studied. Just want to go back to following up.
Sorry, Julia, I'm just going to stop you a second. Mr. Olson, okay, Mr. Olson just muted himself. Thank you very much. So sorry about that, Julia. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Just wanted you to expand on what was mentioned earlier about how we are still seeing the same general trend when it comes to the Indigenous population, but that trajectory is just a little bit different. Can you expand on what we can expect from that trajectory?
Well, what we can expect from the trajectory is not something I could really answer. What I'm saying is the population, the growth in the population of the Indigenous population is faster than the non-Indigenous population. And that is something that we've seen in the past and we now see today for the 2021 data. However, the amount that it is faster than the non-Indigenous population is not as high as in the past. So the growth rate has slowed, but it is still faster than the non-Indigenous population. I don't have the data at hand right now, but when one looks specifically at specific groups, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, on-off reserve within Inuit Nunavut, as we've alluded to, those with registry or treaty status and those without. We do see different patterns there as far as the rates of growth. And so there's a lot to unpack that depends on the different subgroups. But again, in general, what it means is that the growth rate remains faster, but the amount still has slowed.
Okay, we still do have time for questions. A reminder to use the raised hand function if you do have a question. And I think we even have time for, if ever someone who already asked a question wishes to ask another question, we can also do that. Donc, juste un rappel, si vous...
So just a reminder, if you have a question, you can raise your hand on Zoom. We still have more time, so if you have any more questions, do not hesitate to ask them to our panelists.
Okay, seeing there are no other questions, this will put an end to the press conference. Alors, merci beaucoup à nos panélistes.
Thank you very much to our panelists.
Sharing your perspective, and a reminder that you can always come here in person. If ever there's connectivity problems, it'll be a pleasure to have you back again here in person as well. So have a great day. Merci beaucoup. Bonne journée.